Welcome back to Environmental Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are discussing part two of Sober's problems for environmentalism. In the second half of this paper, Sober continues to talk about different obstacles for environmentalism and grounding in environmental ethics, and he really focuses more on the issue of anthropocentrism. The first issue that we deal with is what he calls appeals to what is natural. Now, this is a common, in general, this is a common view in ethics to appeal to nature in order to tell us what we ought to do. In general, this is not a very promising strategy. We tend to cherry pick what is going on in nature and pick the parts of nature that we like. If we turn to the behaviors of animals, for example, to ground what we ought to do, on the one hand, sometimes people will say justify something like violence, say this is the way of the world, and animals don't care if they kill another animal or something like this. But also, animals do all kinds of horrific things. Rape occurs in nature, or something along these lines, forced sexual encounters. Animals eat their young. There's all kinds of domination and stuff like this that we tend not to want to appeal to and endorse. Just because something happens in nature doesn't mean that it's what we ought to do. There's that extra step of endorsing that. Why is it right or wrong? But also, when it comes to environmental ethics, there is an issue about where to draw the line between humans and nature. There is a tendency to want to say that humans and human activities are unnatural. We're not part of nature. And that nature is, in and of itself, kind of pure and should be preserved, right? But of course, where you draw that line is very difficult to do. It seems like human beings are living things, we're animals, and our activities are natural, just like the activities of any other animal, deer or beavers or fish. And all animals modify their environment, they use the environment, and so we do so as well. But of course, we want to say some of the ways in which we modify the environment is extreme. And so, we want to say that an oil refinery is unnatural, but a garden perhaps is. And then there's a question about where do you draw that line, right? Is it just a matter of scope? Is it a matter of the amount of materials? And if you do draw that line, based on what exactly, right? What's an appropriate amount of natural resources to be used and these kinds of things. So it's a very difficult position to try to draw that line. And in the history of thought, the position of human beings in nature is a huge topic, right? The next obstacle that Sober considers is appeals to needs and interests. So this is one strategy to try to use something like a utilitarian calculus in order to gauge whether or not our engagement with the environment is right or wrong. So as we will see later on in the semester, you can take a utilitarian calculus and start to expand it out, right? So the individuals, the kind of happiness, the overall pleasure can be used to include, for example, animals, right? So we should consider, for example, being vegetarian because it would promote the greater good. It would minimize suffering for animals, and it would be a pretty minimal effort on our part. Now, you can also go further and start to include plants, and then even go so far as include inanimate objects, things like mountains, rivers, and so on. Of course, when you start to talk about the needs and interests of something like a river, this becomes very, very difficult. You can identify that there are certain things a river needs in order to exist, but you could say this about just about anything. I think Sober uses the example of a shopping mall. You could say a shopping mall needs, shoppers in order to exist or something like this, and now it looks like the appeals to needs and interests becomes very, very empty. One way to try to draw this line is to stick with living beings, so only plants, and so that is a difficult position to maintain, but some try to use some version of that. The next obstacle that he considers is granting wholes autonomous value. Now, this is a fancy way of saying thinking about the ecosystem, for example, or species as a whole, and thinking about these as having interests or something like this. And this becomes a difficult topic. For one, as we've mentioned, species preservation, for example, is not the preservation of any individual member of that species. So what can be good for, I don't know, wolves may not be good for a particular wolf, right? If we want to preserve wolves, it doesn't mean that we necessarily need to save any particular wolf, right? So these can be at odds with each other. And same thing when it comes to something like the ecosystem, right? We can say what's good for the ecosystem is not necessarily good for any particular member of that ecosystem. For example, we might think a species dying off would be better for the planet or something like this. Now, this, of course, raises the issue about one particular species, which is human beings. It seems pretty obvious that human beings are the main cause for environmental destruction. And so if we start to think of what is good for the ecosystem on a whole, it seems like it would be largely getting rid of human beings in various ways. And this starts to put us in a predicament when it comes to, right, giving an ethical theory. If we have an ethical standard that says that, for example, we should kill off hundreds of thousands or millions of people for the good of the environment, this is a tough position to maintain. It doesn't seem like it is right in any kind of robust sense. And this is where we get into, for example, eco-terrorism and things like this. It seems difficult to justify the killing or major kind of reorganization of human beings for the good of the environment. So all of this kind of culminates into what Sober identifies as the demarcation problem. And this is a problem with identifying the thing that really gives the environment value. What is it that we're basing our sense of value on when it comes to the environment? Now, to give a sense of how this might work is if you look at, for example, consequentialism, the thing that has value that we are kind of organizing that whole theory around is happiness or pleasure, right? It's a pleasure-centered theory. If you look at, for example, deontology, the thing that really anchors our sense of value is autonomy. That's the absolute that we are always kind of organizing the whole theory around. But for the environmental ethics, we're having a difficult time trying to find the thing about the environment that's supposed to tell us what we ought to do. And so what Sober suggests is that we actually treat the environment a little bit differently, and he likens it to the way in which we look at aesthetic value, so value of art. And there are kind of two components to this. One is that we value art because it is beautiful, but also we value art because it is rare, right? There's kind of a what you call particularism about it. We also do this in our kind of day-to-day lives. So, for example, we value, for example, our family members. We value our specific family members because they are ours, right? And they are, my mom is the only mom I ever had or ever will have, this kind of thing. And so you could view the environment along these lines, right? When it comes to your specific environment, so, for example, the Rocky Mountains, or if it has to do with the idea that the Earth is our planet, this kind of thing. You can say that it's valuable because it is ours, because it is our only planet, and say it's valuable because more or less we say it is. We have deemed it valuable, right? So it's a different kind of take on this. I mentioned in my notes that this has a kind of existentialist component to it, where we as human beings kind of decide what is valuable for us, and we are responsible for kind of, what would you say, establishing our sense of value and projecting value onto things. And there's nothing kind of arbitrary or wrong about that. It's just one way to understand value and how it works. So, a lot of interesting things in this paper. This should give us a little bit more of a primer about how we're going to approach the issue of environmental ethics, and we will look at some more determinant theories in the coming weeks. Thanks for watching.